Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's semi-final debate. My name is Jack Cheshire, and I'm the chairman for this debate. My timekeeper is Chris O'Leary. This debate will be judged by a panel of three adjudicators, who are Patrick Merritts, Blake Wadlow, and Norwinka Wirra. The topic of this debate is that Australia should switch to nuclear power. The affirmative team seated to my right is from Unley High School. The negative team seated to my left is from Prince Alfred College. The speaking time for this debate is 6 minutes. A single warning bell will sound 1 minute before the speaking time, and a double bell will sound at the speaking time. Please ensure that your mobile phones are switched off. I declare this debate open and call upon the first affirmative speaker, Nick Hendon.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman. The topic of tonight's debate is that Australia should switch to nuclear power, and we, the affirmative team, strongly agree with this statement. We have defined nuclear power as electricity produced by nuclear fission, and our overall definition is that the Commonwealth of Australia should adopt electricity produced by nuclear fission as its principal source of power. Tonight, I'll be talking about how nuclear energy can actually reduce carbon emissions, as well as talking about how, thanks to our large uranium deposits, we will be saving money on nuclear energy as opposed to other forms of energy. Our second speaker, Alistair, will be speaking about the safety of nuclear energy and how it can combat global warming. And our third speaker, Isaac, will be rebutting the opposition's case and summarizing our argument. I'll begin by providing you with an explanation of the process of harnessing nuclear power. A nuclear reactor relies on the instability of heavy atoms, such as uranium, to generate power. This occurs in a natural process called nuclear decay, where uranium atoms decay into smaller atoms and release heat and radiation in the process. A nuclear reactor uses pure uranium to heat water and spin turbines, like in a coal factory, only the product is entirely pure water. On to my first point. According to the World Bank, America produces 17.56 metric tons of carbon dioxide per capita a year. Without any nuclear power plants, America would produce 25 times this amount. That would be severely enhancing global warming and its effects. This case is actually quite similar in Japan, where Japan produces 9.19 metric tons of carbon dioxide per capita per year. Without nuclear energy, this would increase by 15%. Now, Australia produces 16.93 metric tons, which is very close to America with power stations. Australia does not have any nuclear power stations, and so this is actually a very high number. However, surely by adopting nuclear energy, this number will reduce dramatically, as can be seen with the other countries that I provided to you. Nuclear energy is also incredibly powerful. According to the Nuclear Energy Institution, nearly 11% of the world's power is nuclear, with many countries running mostly on nuclear energy. France uses the most per capita, with 77% of all their energy being provided by nuclear power plants. It should also be mentioned that France also has one of the lowest carbon emissions per capita in the world. This is probably due to their high affiliation with nuclear power. Furthermore, France produces 418 billion kilowatts of energy per hour. And this is also due to nuclear energy, and this energy is also clean. Clearly, nuclear energy is the way to go, as it provides a powerful alternative to your normal coal-based power stations. Finally, switching to nuclear power in Australia is a good idea, as we already have large amounts of uranium in South Australia, the Northern Territory, and Western Australia. According to Geoscience Australia, Australia has approximately 40% of all known uranium in the world. And most of this uranium is actually unmined. Only 3 uranium mines actually exist in Australia. However, there are more that are planned to be built and are currently in the process of being built. We should be capitalizing on resources which we already have on our doorstep, instead of selling it elsewhere. Also, this abundance means that although nuclear power may not be renewable, sourcing it will not be an issue for us in Australia. We will not need to rely on uranium supplies from other countries because we have it right here, and therefore it will be extremely cheap. All we would need to pay for is the mining equipment to mine the uranium. It should also be noted that nuclear energy is not the best solution in the long term, as these deposits will not last forever, obviously. We will run out eventually. However, we are suggesting that nuclear power be a plan to phase into renewable energy options once they become viable. In conclusion, I've explained how nuclear energy can, and already has, reduced carbon emissions to great effect. Also, I've talked about how nuclear power energy is, and for many other countries, is the #1 power supply. Finally, I've explained how uranium can be easily sourced in Australia, and therefore its cost will be much lower. Hence, I have proven that Australia should switch to nuclear power. Thank you.
I call upon the first affirmative speaker, Leon Kaspersky.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman. My name is Leon Kaspersky, and I'm the first negative speaker for the negative side for this evening, Prince Alfred College. As you know, the topic for tonight's debate is that Australia should switch to nuclear power. We as a negative team believe this point to be false. We also agree with the definition stated by the opposition. My first point for this evening is that nuclear power is potentially dangerous, and there are renewable energy sources which are better, that can be put to better use. My second speaker will argue that there are huge costs associated with nuclear power, and we have a moral obligation to to protect the technology. My third speaker will sum up our team's case and rebut the opposition's arguments. Now, before I go on with my debate for tonight, I'd like to point out some flaws in the opposition's arguments. The first speaker tried to persuade you into thinking that nuclear is a great energy alternative to what we have now, and that other countries use it. And this is correct, but let me remind you that he just stated the threat about France and how they're prospering really well with nuclear power. When they did nuclear tests, 200 Tahitis died from radiation over a 5-year period because of this testing prior to them implementing the nuclear power in their own country. The first speaker also said that there's an abundance of uranium in Australia and that would reduce costs. Whilst this is correct, this would not reduce the danger, as I'll further point out in my debate. We also have sunlight, we also have wind on our doorstep. This is a point that I'll elaborate further as to more renewable energy sources that we can use. So my first point for this evening is that the adoption of nuclear power is dangerous, and the dangers should be prevented. Now take two significant nuclear disasters in history, Chernobyl and more recently Fukushima. These places are currently inhabitable, boasting a half-life of 7.5 million years. This statistic alone demonstrates how a nuclear plant has turned from a positive to society to a negative, potentially killing a large population of people with the decaying uranium-235. Now let me remind you that this decaying uranium-235 turns into radioactive thorium and eventually lead. Lead is not only poisonous to plant life and the surrounding environment, but is also poisonous to the surrounding people, potentially killing them. Let me ask you, why would we put ourselves under that much risk? Now a little closer to home. Maralinga, an Aboriginal tribe site west of Adelaide, was the site for nuclear bomb tests conducted by Great Britain. The bomb tests went according to plan. However, one of the dangerous side effects is its radioactive nature, which caused the native Aboriginal tribe to relocate and financially compensated for such a devastating event. Let me remind you that Maralinga is still uninhabitable after over half a century, after only 7 bombs were set off. A nuclear power plant would cause radioactive destruction many times worse than that of the bomb testing. Take Chernobyl, for example, which was the site of a meltdown in 1986, where it is still expected to be uninhabited for over 20,000 years. Whilst older, this is a nuclear plant which is similar to that which the Australian public would like to implement. The opposition might say that nuclear plants have changed and become more modern. This is true, however, Fukushima was partly caused by a natural disaster. This is something which we can't control. Now, take Hiroshima, for example, on the other hand, where it was a nuclear bomb. However, and now it is inhabited by millions of people. Therefore, the point clearly stands that the danger of a nuclear meltdown could cause a catastrophic effect on the country. My second point for tonight is that there are alternatives which prove more beneficial for Australia. Whilst it is true that nuclear power is cleaner than coal and other alternatives, there are significantly more ecologically friendly alternatives which prove to be less dangerous and less harmful to the Australian community. These alternatives include solar and wind, both of which are already implemented to a slight degree in Australia, proving to be cheaper than nuclear power to implement. On my side of the room, ladies and gentlemen, we agree that we believe that there should be a gradual transition to a more green energy source, and that is better than risking the land and lives which span the country. Australia is known to be one of the sunniest countries in the world, boasting over 90% of its days just with sunlight. This would prove excellent with solar power. Now, whilst we have spanning deserts, we also have excellent coastlines which are often affected by wind. This wind could be put to excellent use with the use of wind power. Now, whilst they are expensive, they also give back a significant amount of power sources as well. Now the opposition might say that they're expensive, but the risk of a nuclear meltdown would be equally an equal financial hindrance upon Australia. I would also argue that the meltdowns could be caused through a natural disaster, which we could not prevent. To conclude, I have argued that the adoption of nuclear power is dangerous and therefore more ecologically friendly, and more ecologically friendly alternatives to nuclear power should be adopted. Now, Australia should be seeking clean, safe and renewable energy sources instead of dangerous, costly nuclear power. Thank you.
I call upon the second affirmative speaker, Alistair Corral. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman. The topic of tonight's debate is that Australia should switch to nuclear energy, and we as the affirmative team strongly agree. I'd like to take some time to point out some flaws in the opposition's arguments. Firstly, the opposition has said that there are better alternatives, and while we agree that these alternatives are in some ways safer than nuclear energy, the sad reality is that these alternatives simply do not provide enough energy in bulk for an entire country consistently. All of these energy sources rely on individual aspects like wind, wave, thermal, and solar. The sun isn't out during the night, the wind doesn't always blow, and sadly we don't all live on the beach. These particular energies cannot be a full solution currently for Australia. The opposition has also claimed that nuclear power is incredibly dangerous and the dangers offset the benefits. However, this is simply not true. Not anymore. Technology has indeed advanced, and there are better reactors which are fundamentally protected against such disasters. Also, as is stated in one of my further points, I also talk about these disasters mentioned by the opposition and how these disasters are different and how they will not occur again in the future, or at least in Australia. The first speaker has also said, compared nuclear reactors to bombs. However, this is just a false comparison. Nuclear bombs and reactors are designed for completely different purposes. Ultimately, they are different things. The opposition has pointed out that many people died in testing to do with, the point about France was invalid because many people died in testing. This is wrong. This isn't a comparison today, as ethical standards for safety in the workplace having improved dramatically, especially in Australia, which is the place we are talking about. Tonight, our first speaker, Nick, has already discussed the lower CO2 emissions of nuclear power against coal power and the sheer power of nuclear energy, as well as Australia's huge uranium reserves. I will now discuss the safety of nuclear power, the need to act quickly against global warming, and the storage, and the plausibility of storage of waste in Australia. A third speaker, Isaac, will summarise our points and point out some flaws in the oppositions. My first point tonight is on the safety of nuclear reactors. Despite their poor reputation, nuclear reactors have an excellent safety record. In the 50 years of nuclear energy that has been available to the civil population, amounting to over 16,000 years of lifetime over all reactors that have ever run, there have only been 3 major incidents. The first of these incidents was the 3 Mile Island meltdown in the USA in 1976, in which no damage was done to either people or the environment. The most damaging meltdown was in the 1986 Chernobyl disaster in the USSR, which was only the only meltdown to kill workers or civilians. However, this was a result of poor design and untrained staff. The accident itself occurred when workers turned off the power plant's shutdown features in order to test the plant's turbines. Such an error of judgment does not indicate that nuclear power itself is unsafe, but rather sometimes the people who run it. More recently, in 2011, there was a meltdown in Fukushima, Japan. Again, this was due to poor decision made by the plant designers, who put the plant on a fault line. Japan has a large amount of seismic activity, while Australia does not, meaning that Australia should switch to nuclear energy, even if Japan shouldn't. It is also important to note that today's generation of third plus and the soon-to-be created in 2020 fourth generation reactors are much safer than earlier generations, the 1 and 2s. Considering the benefits to be reaped from nuclear energy, Australia would be foolish to switch to nuclear energy, to not switch to nuclear energy, due to unrealistic safety concerns. This information was sourced by the World Nuclear Association. My second point is on the imperative for humanity to reduce its CO2 emissions, and the fact that nuclear energy is the most realistic way of doing this in the short to medium term.
While nuclear energy is stated as a non-renewable energy source, it means it cannot be a permanent solution. It is the best option, as I said, in the short to medium term. According to a 2004 report by the International Panel on Climate Change, Australia needs to significantly reduce its CO2 emissions by 2014. Germany, one of the leading countries on renewable energy, is aiming only to have 60% of its energy as renewable by 2050. The technology simply does not exist for us to act in time. This is contrary to nuclear energy, which will be available in great formats in the next 20 years or so. If we want to reduce CO2 emissions, nuclear is the best. Finally, nuclear waste nuclear waste can be stored effectively and safely. It comes in 3 different types: high, low, and intermediate concentrations. 90% of waste is in the low category, which is a majority of it. Another 7% is in the intermediate, and the highest is only 3%. Low grade can be simply buried in the ground, and the other grades, the medium grade only needs a bit of sheltering and a bit of sophisticated technology, while the high grade does need some reasonable treatment. Basically, Australia has a lot of free land with 362 square kilometres per 1,000 people. This means that Australia should build nuclear reactors. It would be a good idea for us to store waste, as we have the land. Thank you. I call upon the second negative speaker, Aidan Kelly.
Australia should not switch to nuclear power. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, as second speaker for the negative team, I would like to bring up several issues with Australia switching to nuclear power. But first, I'd like to point out some of the fallacious arguments presented by the affirmative team. The first speaker said that we have plenty of uranium in Australia. We don't need to worry about it. Later in his speech, he then said it was a finite resource. It is a finite resource. We will run out. Further, only 0.72% of uranium that comes out of the ground is usable, is uranium-235. That is the isotope that is the fissile used in nuclear reactors. He also said that the fault of the nuclear disasters is not of the power plants themselves, it's the people who run it, it's the people who design it, it's the people who build it. Were the problems caused as a result of nuclear power, a huge power? Yes. The problem is in nuclear power. You can train people as much as they like, but they will still make a mistake. We're only human. He also said that nuclear power is safer. We can protect it against against events, and we hardly have any earthquakes in Australia. Adelaide will receive earthquakes. Think of the damage caused in the earthquake in last century, when the entire Glenelg jetty was damaged. What would happen if that happened to a nuclear power plant? No more Adelaide. He also said that nuclear waste can be stored safely. It's the cost. The United Kingdom produced 5 billion metric tonnes of nuclear waste. Sorry, 5 million metric tonnes of nuclear waste. But still, that would cost over £8 billion to store. And that's just low-level waste, the cheapest waste to store. He also said that nuclear power reduces carbon emissions. Are we all prepared to swap a little bit of global warming for a massive disaster? Tonight I'll be arguing 2 points. First, that nuclear power has extreme costs associated with it. And second, that I'll argue that there is a huge moral obligation that is associated with anything nuclear. Firstly, the cost. Disposal of nuclear waste is expensive. As I said, 5 million tonnes of nuclear waste is disposed of by the United Kingdom. Let's look at the cost of that. In the United States example, we have the Yucca Mountain disposal site, which cost $9 billion to produce. Our total, and it only holds 77,000 tonnes of nuclear waste, a total of $117,000 per tonne. And then we also have low-level waste. It's relatively safe, but it has to be disposed of properly. 4.4 million tonnes are produced by the United Kingdom. Now, it costs £2,000 to get rid of a metre cubed of this. That ends up being, according to Nuclear Engineering International, that means that it costs over £8.8 billion to get rid of just the low-level waste, the cheapest kind, which translates to 19 billion Australian dollars. Then we move to high-level waste, which costs a further £201 million, or 443 million Australian dollars. Then we look at refinement of nuclear power. As I said, it comes out of the ground, only 0.72% is useful. It must be refined. What does that require? Energy. What does energy require? Costs. And further, we have to develop the technology. And what does that technology have? Waste products. Uranium, when it comes out of the ground, has uranium-238 in it. A highly radioactive isotope that must be disposed of. Furthermore, as our first speaker said, we can't put a nuclear power plant in the middle of Adelaide, the middle of Sydney. If it fails, the results will be too big, too dire. If it went off in Sydney, 20% of our population would die. So we have to put it far away. But what do you have to do then? Transport it. With our current electrical technology, there will be enormous losses with putting it there. It is just too inefficient. My second point tonight is that as a country that possesses nuclear items, we have a moral obligation to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands. In the wrong hands, it can get turned into weapons of mass destruction. As Sir Mark often said, I suddenly realised that anyone who has a nuclear reactor can extract plutonium from the reactor and make nuclear weapons. So clearly, if we do not keep this technology safe, we will end up with countries with nuclear weapons. We will end up with North Korea. Speaking of North Korea, if that was improper. The Soviet Union gave them resources, and surprise, surprise, they're a nuclear power. We have a moral obligation as a country with nuclear power, if this were to occur, which it shouldn't, to protect our infrastructure. Without nuclear power, what is there to protect? Coal. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I've argued 2 points. First, that the cost of nuclear power is just too great. With the disposal of it, with the refinement of it, through the scientific research and actually doing it. Second, I've argued that we have a moral obligation to protect this technology, to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands.
I call upon the third affirmative speaker, Isaac Tilly-Swift.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman, the topic of tonight's debate is that Australia should switch to nuclear energy, and we, the affirmative team, strongly agree with this statement. Before summarising my team's case, I'd like to take the time to point out some misleading claims the opposition has made in theirs. The second speaker said that a little bit of global warming is worth it if we can avoid a massive disaster, suggesting that the CO2 reductions that would result from switching to nuclear energy isn't worth the potential for a meltdown. However, they're ignoring the fact that a little bit of global warming is a massive disaster. The United Nations has already determined that the planet can only take a 2-degree rise in its temperature. This could be classed as a little bit of global warming. 2 degrees isn't much, but it will be a massive disaster for humanity. Taking the risks, which are, as our second speaker pointed out, are very small with nuclear energy, would be worth avoiding the massive disaster of climate change for all of humanity, not just Australia. The second speaker also discussed the cost of nuclear energy, but as I have just said, climate change could spell the end of humanity. The costs are worth it, for if humanity is wiped out, what will the money be worth to us? Nothing. The second speaker also said that despite our indications that nuclear power plants are safe, they could still be dangerous because people will inevitably make mistakes, because they're flawed. However, we trust people to do a lot in our community when we think about it. We trust them to look after our health, to teach our children, and to run our military, which in many countries has access to nuclear weapons. We must be prepared to trust them to look after things like nuclear power. It should also be considered that we trust people to drive cars, which historically have killed a lot more people than nuclear power has. As our second speaker indicated, in only one case, the Chernobyl meltdown, did a nuclear power reactor actually kill civilians or workers. Their safety record is good. The second speaker also said that accidents like Fukushima could happen in Adelaide because there are fault lines. Yes, but the amount of seismic activity that occurs in Australia is nothing near like that which occurs in Japan, where powerful earthquakes occur on a semi-regular basis, and tsunamis are a very real threat. We would not put a nuclear reactor on a fault line. It's just bad planning. The second speaker also said that placing a nuclear power plant in the middle of an industrial centre, such as Adelaide or Sydney, would present a serious risk. There is a very simple solution to this problem. Put it somewhere else. As our second speaker indicated, Australia has a very low population density. We have large areas which are unindustrialised and uninhabited. These would be perfect for placing a nuclear power plant. And they wouldn't provide, and it wouldn't pose much risk in the very, very unlikely event that there were a meltdown and we were unable to contain it. The second speaker has also said that implementing nuclear energy in Australia leads to the risk of Australia developing nuclear weapons. This is, however, a slippery slope fallacy. The sheer fact that we embrace nuclear energy does not mean that we end up switching to having a nuclear arsenal in Australia. It should be noted that countries in Europe, such as Germany, do not possess nuclear weapons, but they do have nuclear power plants. And in fact, I would go further and say that by keeping the uranium in Australia rather than selling it to a country like India, which is known to manufacture nuclear weapons, we are reducing the odds that Australian uranium will be used for nuclear weapons. Second speaker also argued that our first speaker contradicted himself when he spoke about the fact that that we have bountiful uranium in Australia at the moment, but it is a finite source. These statements, however, do not contradict each other. What he was saying was that in the long run, we will need alternative plans. It's not going to last forever. However, we need to act fast because of climate change, and the best way to act fast is to go to a source which, although it might be finite, will provide us with the bountiful energy we need quickly. The first speaker at great length discussed Chernobyl and demonstrating the risk of a nuclear meltdown. However, as our second speaker said, Chernobyl is the only incident in human history where people have actually been killed in a nuclear meltdown. And very, very poor safety procedures were followed on the day of that meltdown. If we were to switch to nuclear energy in Australia, we would have clear regulations. We would have learned from the Chernobyl disaster, and we wouldn't have the same sort of poor incentives that a communist regime had. And people would be more motivated to build sturdy power plants for the sake of the reputation of their industries. The first speaker also said that their team would support a gradual transition to renewable energy. However, as we've already demonstrated, we don't have time for a gradual transition. We need to act fast. Ladies and gentlemen, the topic of tonight's debate is that Australia should switch to nuclear energy, and we, the affirmative team, find this statement to be true. Our first speaker discussed the fact that nuclear power emits less carbon dioxide than coal power, making it better for dealing with climate change, and also that nuclear power is highly powerful and can power over 70% of the French energy requirements. He also reminded you that Australia has the largest nuclear reserves in the world and is the third largest exporter of uranium. Our second speaker demonstrated that, contrary to popular belief, nuclear energy is quite safe, and that we need to act quickly on climate change. And, like the safety of nuclear power, waste management is a lot less complicated than popular opinion would suggest. Thus, we have proved that Australia should switch to nuclear energy.
I call upon the third negative speaker, Unley.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The topic of tonight's debate, to reiterate, is that Australia should switch to nuclear power. As the third speaker for the negative team, we are totally against this. Now, I'd just like to highlight 5 key issues that have been contended by both sides on the floor tonight. The issues are the issues of safety of nuclear power, the issue of the environmental costs or the environmental benefits of nuclear power, thirdly, of the alternatives to nuclear power, such as renewable energy, and whether it is viable for Australia to adopt this. Fourthly, the costs of nuclear power, so the financial costs that is. And fifth, the sustainability of nuclear power and its viability for the future of Australia. Now, the opposition has had several fallacious and disingenuous arguments that I would like to address in my arguments. Firstly, that of safety. It has been said by the opposition that there have been only, that by and large, in the history of nuclear power, it has been nuclear power has had a good safety record with only minor blips and road bumps on the way that caused a few deaths. Oh, sorry, quite a lot of deaths. So these 3 major disasters that were mentioned by the opposition was Chernobyl, Fukushima, and 3 Mile Island. They perhaps neglected to mention quite a lot more disasters, such as the Windscale fire in the UK. So that was a nuclear power plant which was operating, and because of fire that was caused by a nearby farm, I believe, this caused a lot of damage and a lot of dangerous consequences. I've also to point out from my first speaker's points, Leon's points, that due to French testing of nuclear power, 200 Tahitians died of radiation sickness due to French testing. Now, the problem with that was that the French testing were within regulations and obligations of international law and maritime law. However, this still caused external and unpredictable effects in the local population, resulting in 200 Tahitians' deaths. Furthermore, there have been reports that a large number of the local population was secretly shipped off by military planes to Paris to be cured for, to be looked after for cancer, and these unrecorded instances of cover-ups of the French's mistake with nuclear power shows that though nuclear power is very seductive, major governments and major corporations will use any means possible to hide any sort of defects and problems due to nuclear power. So this sort of undermines the argument presented by the opposition regarding the safety of nuclear power. So to my second point, about environmental costs or benefits. The affirmative team seems to argue that, nuclear power causes a reduction in carbon emissions of nations, and as a result, this will slow down global warming and help with a situation of climate change. We, on the other hand, argue that even if this may slow down the impact of global warming and reduce carbon emissions, this will inevitably lead to dangers such as radioactivity, which will damage the immediate environment with the problem of disposal, refinement, and mining for uranium. And furthermore, also the social implications that were covered by Leon, our first speaker, of the problem of land rights in Australia. There has been significant opposition to building nuclear power plants on Aboriginal heritage land. So the problem with the opposition's argument regarding nuclear power helping the environment is this is quite disingenuous. They suggest that somehow renewable energy will not help solve climate change fast enough as nuclear power would because of its reduction of carbon emissions. But the problem with that is they also pointed out that nuclear power would probably not be sustainable. And this is because we would eventually run out of uranium resources. So the fact is, we're spending a lot of money building nuclear power infrastructure. We're using nuclear power. We're expending a lot of resources to mine that with the associated environmental, social costs and threats. And in the end, it's going to run out. After it has run out, what are we going to do? We are just delaying the problem of global warming and climate change to a future generation where this threat will be a larger problem. So we propose that instead of going through a detour of the option of nuclear power, we should stick on the road of development and scientific advancement of renewable resources. So, in summary of my team's case, our first speaker, Leon, has mentioned the danger of nuclear power, the history of nuclear power, such as the problem of the British test bombing in Maralinga, the problem of human factors in Chernobyl and Fukushima. Let me note to the audience that perhaps the designs were okay, but eventually there are always human errors, and this is augmented by nuclear power.